All right, y'all, you're Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. Today, we're talking about the two newest additions to the Atlanta Falcons roster, an offensive tackle, Chuma Edoga, and defensive lineman, Matt Dickerson, and what we can expect from them this season. We'll be talking about the 13 players that the Falcons added to their practice squad and speculate a little bit about what other impending roster moves we may see the Falcons make over the next few days.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host, your very humble podcast host of this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast here on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Give us a like, hit that bell, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today we're, getting into the nerdy roster stuff with the subsequent transactions that the Falcons have made after final cuts. We use air quotes, final cuts were made on Tuesday. We've been talking all week long about how things are fluid, and they remain fluid and probably will continue to be fluid when it comes to this roster as the Falcons build towards their week one matchup against the New Orleans Saints. But today they claimed two players off of waivers in former New York Jets offensive tackle Chuma Edoga, and they also added former Kansas City Chief as well as Tennessee Titan defensive end Matt Dickerson as well, making room for those two guys. They did cut defensive backs Mike Ford and D Marlowe. More on that. I think those moves are temporarily, but let's talk about the two new additions. Let's start off talking about Edoga. Basically, he's come in here to be a swing tackle. I know Ian Rappaport put it out there, and Arthur Smith was very quick to dispel this in his post-practice press conference that Edoga was going to come in and compete for right tackle, but he's coming in to compete at the swing tackle position. Edoga is a former third-round pick for the Jets back in 2019. He's come off the bench, basically been a swing tackle for the Jets the last couple of years, had limited opportunities coming off the bench in the event of injuries. Mekhi Becton's been beat up these last couple of years. And Edoga wasn't great in those opportunities. I remember Edoga being a guy that I thought the Falcons might draft in that 2019 draft because he showed out at the Senior Bowl. I think he was the offensive line practice player of the week that week. And we know that the former regime, just as much as the current regime, loved their Senior Bowl guys. Obviously, the Falcons wound up trading up for Caleb McGarry in that 2019 draft. And so Edoga will come in here, be the swing tackle for the Falcons. He does have experience playing both left and right tackle for the Jets the last couple of years, which is something that we've noted with Jermaine Ifedi, who's been exclusively playing on the right side of the offensive line, working at right tackle, apparently worked some at right guard today in practice as well. But let's talk a little bit about Matt Dickerson, notably old college teammate of Jacob Tuioti Mariner back at UCLA, was an undrafted free agent back in 2018 with the Titans, known to Arthur Smith and Dean Pease from their days in Tennessee back then, was able to make the Titans roster, spent 3 years with them. In the year since leaving Tennessee, has kind of bounced around the league, starting with the Raiders last year and then the Cardinals earlier this summer, and then was picked up by the Chiefs and obviously cut this past week. In the 3 years he was in Tennessee, did not get a ton of playing time, about 280 snaps across those 3 years. If you look at his average PFF grade across those 3 years, it was about a 55, and finished with 0 sacks, 2 quarterback hits, 4 pressures, and a tackle for loss in those 3 seasons combined. And I point that out because it's very similar to the stat line that Marlon Davidson put up last year in 2021 with 270 snaps, about a 55 PFF grade, 1 sack, 1 quarterback hit, 4 pressures, and 1 tackle for loss. So we'll see if the new MD is better than the old MD. But given how Matt Dickerson, the new MD, has kind of bounced around the league, and the Falcons will be, I think, his 4th team in the last 12 months. I'm not going to necessarily hold my breath that he's going to be significantly more contributor than what we've gotten out of Marlon Davidson these last couple of years, but we'll see if he can do that. Now, talking about the releases of Mike Ford and D. Marlowe, as I said earlier, they're likely temporary. It leaves the Falcons with only 8 defensive backs on their active roster as of today. And last year, every single week, the Falcons had 9 defensive backs on their active 48-man roster, in addition to guys that were inactive throughout the season. So unless the Falcons have suddenly decided that they are good with having less special teams contributors, and that's really what Ford and Marlowe are likely to do this year, it's almost certainly that they'll be back. And my guess is we'll probably see 2 players currently on the Falcons roster go on injured reserve officially tomorrow. It was notable to me that Arthur Smith, when asked about the health and situation of Drake London, Marlon Davidson, and Jalen Mayfield by our guy D-Led, he talked about Drake London still on track, being ready for week 1, but noted that Davidson and Mayfield, there will be a clearer picture about those 2 guys as we move forward. And that was the same language that Arthur Smith used at the beginning of that presser, talking about the fluid situation with the roster, that we'll have a clearer picture, he said, tomorrow, indicating Thursday, and then certainly by Friday. So that makes me want to speculate that, given that he wasn't going to say anything specific about Davidson and Mayfield's injury situation, that they are 2 prime candidates to potentially go on injured reserve on that short-term IR, as we discussed yesterday with Jarvis Davis, that you have to wait till after final cuts to put players on injured reserve if you want them to be eligible to come back on the short-term IR, which is 4 weeks now. And given that Davidson and Mayfield's injuries aren't necessarily season ending, we may see that, but it may be another player like a John FitzPatrick is also eligible about that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode. So those are the 2 moves, 2 depth pieces along the trenches. We've been talking all summer long and over the last couple of days that these were 2 likely moves that you would see the Falcons make. Once they cut Rick Leonard, that opened up a need for a true swing tackle, which Jermaine Ifedi isn't necessarily, because of that limited experience playing on only the right side rather than the left side. And we've been talking basically since May that the Falcons need more D-line help. And so, we'll see if Dickerson can provide that. But we'll talk a little bit more about Chuma Edoga and what he has a opportunity, at least. Again, not high on Matt Dickerson's future here in Atlanta, at least currently. We'll see. But, at least Edoga, you can make a decent case that, he's got a much better opportunity to do something here in Atlanta over the next year. And we'll also talk about the 13 players that the Falcons added to the practice squad as we continue today's episode, guys. But we know that the start of the NFL season is right around the corner. And whether you're into sports betting or fantasy, if you're looking for that competitive edge to help you win this season, I highly recommend the Elias Game app. It's the ultimate sports betting and fantasy companion for the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball. Elias Game Plan is the only sports app from the most trusted name in sports stats, the Elias Sports Bureau, the official statisticians of U.S. pro sports leagues, including the NFL. This app is your one-stop source for team and player stats, head-to-head comparisons. The expert analysis that you get from Elias comes from the most respected research team in the industry, and you guys know how much I love well-researched analysis. It's the perfect app for me, and so take my advice and download the Elias Game Plan app today. And right now, I have a special offer. When you subscribe, you can get a 14-day free trial off your first monthly subscription plan, but you can only do so if you use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. So find the Elias Game Plan sports betting app in the App Store or Play Store today and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. So, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Always recommend your second listen, and why not plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows with 4 hosts breaking down not only local sports, but national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste, all in the same podcast feed, all the same feeds that you're checking out Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. And if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll get the Locked On Braves postcast and the Locked On Falcons postcast. Jarvis and I will be there Sunday evening, Sunday afternoon, live on Locked On Sports Atlanta's YouTube channel to break down everything that we see in that week 1 matchup against the Saints and every game after that point. And also, if you don't get the chance to check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube live, you'll still be able to hear that postcast in addition to my rapid reaction podcast on the Locked On Falcons podcast audio feed. So let's talk a little bit more about Chuma Edoga, because his signing is interesting, given you need to have depth in this league, right? And I think I talked about this earlier this offseason about, the importance of having depth along the offensive line due to the fact that injuries are common on the offensive line. I've done research over the last 26 years, that well-researched analysis that is a staple of the Locked On Falcons podcast. But over the last 26 years, keeping track of this, the Falcons have had only 3 seasons in that span of time where they had the same starting 5 start every single game along the offensive line. That was 1998, 2010, and 2016. Correlation does not equal causation, but there's obviously a correlation between continuity up front and team success, although last year they had a relatively high degree of continuity with the same starting 5 starting 15 games, and it didn't necessarily lead to a huge degree of success. Although we can make the argument that instead of maybe giving Arthur Smith, credit for having this magic elixir that led to this team overachieving, maybe the stability, despite having a terrible offensive line last year, the stability allowed that unit in this team to exceed expectations. Again, I'll let you guys, argue about that in the comments, but something, at least food for thought. But, basically that points out that, 23 out of 26 seasons, at least one backup started a game. Right, that's an 88% likelihood that at least one of these backups, whether it's Chuma Edoga, whether it's Jermaine Ifedi, whether it's Jalen Mayfield, or whomever is the backup center, we still don't know who that's going to be. As Wednesday, Matt Hennessy was getting the first team reps. I believe Drew Dalman was getting the first team reps at the center spot on Tuesday. So I guess we'll find out in the next couple of days who's going to be the starter at week 1. But whoever that guy is, the backup, there's a 88% chance based off of Falcons history that one of those guys will start at least 1 games. And then when you look at the years where the Falcons have had at least 3 different 5-man units, or 4 different 4 or more different units, there's been, I think, 14 out of 26 years they had 4 or more. 21 out of 26 years they've had 3 or more. So good probability that depth, this is why depth matters on the offensive line. It's also critical for this specific team because we already know that we're kind of top heavy, if you can call that, because we have 2 proven quality starting offensive linemen, and everybody else is a big question mark. And one of those proven guys is Jake Matthews, and it's Chuma Edoga that's going to step in for an injured Jake Matthews, whether he's missing a quarter, whether he's missing a game, or whether he's missing a month. And if you have a huge drop off there, given all the other concerns that you have among the starting offensive line, that's basically a death knell for this team and for this offense moving forward. So you need that drop off. There is going to be a drop off from Jake Matthews to Chuma Edoga, but you don't want that to be steep here. So it's going to be important for Chuma Edoga to get up to speed at some point this season for the Falcons in the event of a Jake Matthews injury. And then you also factor in that Edoga is for an extended audition this year, not only to be a body this year in the depth piece this year, but also potentially could be auditioning for a long-term role here in Atlanta. Again, the odds aren't great that he'll succeed there. I'm not a huge fan of reclamation projects, but there's a chance there, right? Because Jake Matthews is the only current offensive tackle on this roster, not Edoga, not McGarry, not Ifedi, that is under contract beyond this season. All 3 of those guys, Edoga, Ifedi, and McGarry, are free agents next year. And we sit here probably not too optimistic, even as a captive on McGarry Island, feeling like the Falcons starting right tackle for week 1 of 2023 next year is currently on the roster. But there's an opportunity for any one of those 3 guys, should they perform at a high enough level, particularly given the quality of pass rushers that they'll be facing: Clowney, Bosa, Jordan, Barrett, Burns, etc., TJ Watt this year. If they can prove that they can hold their own against the elite pass rushers, any one of those guys will earn an opportunity to keep the job here in Atlanta beyond the season. And not to mention, even though Jake Matthews got an extension this offseason, it really was essentially a 1-year extension for him. And so beyond this year, the Falcons could move on from Jake Matthews as early as 2024 when he's at the age of 32. So not only is there a high potential of turnover at the right tackle position in the next 6 months, over the next 18 or more months, there's also the potential that the Falcons may be looking for a new left tackle. And again, not going to sit here and say, oh, Chuma Edoga is going to be the heir apparent behind Jake Matthews to replace him in 2 years. But at least theoretically, if he can play well, should he get opportunities, and again, 88% chance that he may get those opportunities, as mentioned earlier, then this is a real opportunity for him to sort of be the rare reclamation project that seems to go the Falcons' way, which it rarely does, at least in recent memories, as far as that goes. So I think there's an opportunity for Chuma Edoga here, or really anybody that could have came in here to be that backup behind Jake Matthews at the left tackle position, and we'll just sort of have to see how it goes. Obviously, the offensive line, the defensive line remain the two biggest question marks on this football team, and we'll find out September 11th against the Saints, whether or not those guys can step up in including Jake Matthews as well as McGarry and all those other guys. So that will be something to keep an eye on, and certainly we've talked about it quite a bit over the last 8 to 8 months. We'll continue to talk probably about it over the next 6 to 8 months, but hopefully it's positive things and positive vibes that we're talking about with the offensive line. Again, probably not going to hold my breath, but hey, let me know how optimistic or confident you guys are in these offensive line and defensive line heading into the season at this point in time. I certainly feel better about the defensive line than I did 3 months ago. I don't feel great about it. I don't feel better or worse about the offensive line. I just feel like, okay, like it shouldn't be, it was a F minus last year, so maybe it'll be a D minus. I feel like there is progress, but we'll see how much progress there is. So let me know in the comments or via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or hit me up on social media at Locked On Falcons on Facebook or Twitter what you think about this offensive and defensive line at this point in time, a week and a half ahead of the week 1 game. But we'll talk more about the Falcons practice squad additions, 13 officially as of Wednesday afternoon. And there's, 3 more spots available, which will, again, in that sort of clearer picture, fluid situation in the roster, we'll probably get some fluidity and some cementing, I guess is the right word, over the next couple of days there by Friday. But we'll talk about the 13 additions that the Falcons did make, as well as the current injury situation with various players being out of the picture, and whether or not that will indicate that there will be future transactions over the next couple of days as we try to cement this fluid or solidify this fluid roster situation as we continue today's episode of Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get into that, let's talk about something very serious. And you may be one of those people that thinks it's okay to drive while you're stoned. And you probably think, what's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit. It's no big deal, right? Well, you're wrong. The truth is your reaction times slow way down when you're high. You not only put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel. If you feel different, you drive different, drive high, get a DUI. So, guys, before we talk about the Falcons practice squad, I do want to remind you that if you're checking us out on YouTube, why not hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, and give us a like. And if you're checking out the audio version of this podcast, particularly on Apple, give us that 5-star review. I don't know if people are still giving out iTunes reviews at this point in time, since I think iTunes went the way of the dodo bird 2 years ago or whatever. But, whatever your podcast app of choice, hit that 5-star review or whatever it is to tell us how much you love, this very serious Falcon show by your host, aka Sirius Black, aka Aaron Freeman. So with that being said, let's talk about the Falcons 13 practice squad additions. They signed Caleb Huntley. They signed wide receivers Frank Darby and Cam Batson and Josh Ali. They signed tight end Michael Pruitt, offensive lineman Justin Schaefer, Ryan Nuzul, and Tyler Vrabel, defensive lineman Derek Tangelo, edge rusher Jordan Brailford, cornerbacks Kadar Holman and Matt Hankins, and safety Tease Tabor were the 13 additions that they made. 8 of those players, Frank Darby, Pruitt, Schaefer, Nuzul, Vrabel, Tangelo, Hankins, and Tabor, were guys that if you listen to last Friday's episode in the preview up to the Jaguars game. I mentioned as 8 of the guys that were in my 16-man practice squad prediction. So there aren't surprises. The Falcons did bring those guys back. We did mention after that Jaguars game that, I think Quadri Olison was on that. And then we mentioned that, Caleb Huntley in the performance in that against the Jaguars certainly did enough to make a very compelling case to be the Falcons running back on the practice squad over Quadri Olison. Obviously, Olison, if you didn't hear, wound up signing with the Dallas Cowboys on their practice squad. So that certainly cemented Huntley getting that opportunity here to stick in Atlanta. Brailford was not a guy I think I projected to make the practice squad, but certainly was kind of a bubble guy in the event that the Falcons wanted to find another pass rusher. And after they cut Kwoni Deng, that opened up the door for him basically being the only other pass rusher that they had in camp this past year. And then Batson, we had, I think Stanley Berryhill was sort of my pick in that initial projection. But given that Batson was working ahead of Berryhill on the depth chart throughout the preseason, kind of indicated that the Falcons liked Batson a little bit more than Stanley Berryhill, despite, the accolades that he was getting in the early part of training camp. And so, with all those guys covered that are coming back to Atlanta that most of you guys are very familiar with from, the last month in the preseason and in training camp, there are 2 new faces. That's Josh Ali and Kadar Homan. Now, Ali is notable because he was the other wide receiver at Kentucky the last couple of years, starting opposite Wan'Dale Robinson. And it's notable because he got in a car accident before the Citrus Bowl this past year and thus missed out in the offseason. I think he was, due to go to some all-star games and obviously potentially combine and pro days and whatnot, and apparently worked out last week, I think Thursday or Friday of last week before the Jaguars game. I think it was whatever the second day of the joint practices was. So that I guess that was Thursday. He worked out on that day and apparently, I guess, impressed the Falcons enough to give him an opportunity. And so he's one of those guys that essentially is a late undrafted free agent addition. So obviously seems healthy and ready to go. So we'll see what he can do. Does have some return experience from his days at Kentucky. So an interesting sort of developmental piece that the Falcons can add at the wide receiver position. And Holman is notable. He was a former 6th-round pick of the Packers back in 2019. Athletic guy, has a lot of speed, ran a 4.38 40 at his combine or pro day or whichever one of those. Didn't play a ton of defense over the 2 years he was with the Packers, but did contribute on special teams. Worked as a gunner with the Packers, especially in 2020, where that speed comes into handy. And certainly, given the fluid situation surrounding Mike Ford, you can kind of think of Holman as kind of I wouldn't say a replacement, because again, we expect Ford to be back at some point in the next couple of days. But, Holman could be sort of a stand-in for Mike Ford in the event of an injury to Mike Ford, or, injuries force Mike Ford to have to start games for the Falcons later this fall. And so Holman can come in and potentially contribute as a gunner on that punt team, replacing Ford in that. So those are the 13 practice squad additions. We probably got 3 more moves to be made. And, those could be guys currently on the roster right now, as well as some of these other guys that the Falcons have cut. And what's notable is when it comes to Wednesday's practice, at least during the 30-minute viewing portion that, was observed by the Falcons media members, notably Cordero Patterson was not out there. Drake London was not out there. Brian Edwards was not out there. John FitzPatrick was not out there. Jalen Mayfield was not out there. Marlon Davidson, Arnold Ebiketie, Deion Jones, Mike Ford, and D. Marlowe. Obviously, we know Ford and Marlowe weren't there because they were released. London, Mayfield, and Davidson are dealing with injury issues. Fitzpatrick has an undisclosed injury. I know Arthur Smith mentioned that somebody was at a funeral. I didn't hear the specific player in that regard. And I think someone had a child being born. I don't know if that was in reference to Brian Edwards earlier in the summer or someone else in the last week. So that may clarify some of those guys. But as I mentioned at the top of the show, London's still on track to play week 1. Mayfield and Davidson, given sort of the nebulous comments made by Arthur Smith, they may be candidates for that short-term IR over the next day. So I would not be shocked at all if both of those guys go on short-term IR and the Falcons bring back both Ford and Marlowe to replace them. Is similar to what we saw last year, where the Falcons cut Josh Harris and then that cleared up a roster spot for them to claim Colby Gossett, then they re-signed Harris, and then I can't remember the roster move that they made to create Then they put Josh Andrews on short-term IR, and I think that was the move that created a space for Wayne Gallman to be picked up the next day. So again, fluidity last year. We're going to get fluidity over the next couple of days. Another potential IR candidate, I think, is John FitzPatrick. I was shocked to see John FitzPatrick make the initial 53-man roster, simply because the fact that he was a 7th-string tight end at one point in the preseason, with Tucker Fisk and Felipe Franks and Parker Hesse and Kyle Pitts and Anthony Firkser and Michael Pruitt, all working ahead of him in those games. And we talked about that, I think, on the podcast, where FitzPatrick, due to various injuries, had a shortened offseason, and so may not be up to speed fully to deserve more playing time. And then when he did get on the field, wasn't exactly stellar in that regard. And so going back to the comments made yesterday with Anthony Firkser, like, I would be shocked at this point in time that Anthony Firkser got cut and John FitzPatrick is going to wind up being on the Falcons roster. So I do kind of expect that to potentially be another move to keep an eye on over the next couple of days, where the Falcons put FitzPatrick, in addition to potentially Mayfield and Davidson, on injured reserve as short-term options, and then bring back Ford and Marlowe and potentially Firkser as well. So we'll keep you guys up to date on all these roster moves that the Falcons may make. Tomorrow we'll probably do a Q&A, because I know there's a listener question that wants to ask about play calling. Won't get in that on today, but we have the potential to get into that tomorrow, as well as any other questions that you guys submit to me. And you can do so via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, at mail.com. You can do so by leaving a comment here on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And of course, you can hit me up on Twitter and Facebook at Locked On Falcons as well. And we'll have a couple of other ways that you guys, some fun new ways that you guys will be able to submit mailbag questions and Q&A questions in the future. But, we'll, and new features coming up with the podcast, other ways that you guys can interact with me this upcoming season. But we're not quite ready to announce that here on the pod quite yet. But certainly look forward to that. Hopefully there will be an announcement next week, if not before the Saints game, but after the Saints game. So keep that in mind. That's what we call a tease in the industry. So there you guys have it. I have teased you enough for today's episode. Tomorrow, potential Q&A, as well as keeping you up to date on what other roster moves. Next week, we should have a bunch of sort of season and week 1 previews for you to get you guys geared up. I hope that, after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen, you can make the Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 your second listen, in addition to Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks. The Ultimate Pro Football Preview is an 8-episode extravaganza which began Wednesday, today, August 31st, as some of you guys are checking this out, or yesterday, as some of you guys are checking this out. And it will run for 8 episodes, getting you guys geared up for this upcoming season, where local experts on the Locked On Network, like myself, as well as Odyssey NFL insiders, will get you geared up. So all you got to do is search Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 in the Odyssey app, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. So guys, really appreciate it. Till then.